The mysterious disappearance of the 7 sisters of Selkirk. A dark secret from 1899. On an October morning sharpened by frost and silence, the town of Selkirk awakened to a truth it was never meant to understand. The Thornfield house stood unchanged beneath a pale sky, its windows dark, its doors locked, its breath held. Inside, 7 beds remained perfectly made, corners tucked with a precision that spoke of habit and obedience. The blankets had not been stirred, the pillows bore no warmth. The rooms felt hollow, like mausoleums pretending to be bedrooms. By dawn, it was clear that the 7 daughters of Gabriel Thornfield had vanished, not in panic or struggle, but as if they had been quietly erased. There were no footprints in the frost lining the sills, no scratches on the glass, no hinges creaked in the night, no locks splintered. Their night garments still hung where careful hands had placed them, folded with a reverence that now felt mocking. It was as though the sisters had risen from their beds and stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the suggestion that they had once been real. The house itself seemed to recoil, its hallways whispering with absence. The sheriff arrived before the sun had climbed the hills, his boots echoing too loudly against the floors. What he wrote that morning would not be spoken aloud for generations. The report, locked away by order beyond the town's reach, contained a detail so unsettling that even a grieving father was denied its truth. Every bedroom showed signs of deliberate searching, drawer opened and closed, spaces examined with care, yet nothing was taken. No jewelry, no letters, no money hidden for dreams of escape. Someone had looked for something specific, something that could not be seen, and had left with it unseen. As news spread, Selkirk drew inward, its confidence cracking like ice on a river. This was a town that believed in progress, in railways and silver veins, in the promise that the West could polish any soul willing to work. The air carried the scent of smoke and ore, of leaves decaying beneath boots that hurried along the main road. Wagons groaned under the weight of wealth torn from the earth. Trains arrived bearing men in tailored coats and eyes that measured everything. Selkirk had grown quickly, swelling with ambition and money, balanced between its raw beginnings and the civility it mimicked from distant cities. But beneath the polished storefronts and hopeful sermons lived unease. The miners whispered unfair contracts and distant owners. Families spoke softly of daughters sent away for opportunity, their letters thinning, then stopping altogether. Promises of respectable work in far-off places had become common, and farewells were often rushed, explanations rehearsed. The town told itself these were signs of advancement. It told itself many lies. At the center of Selkirk's rise stood Gabriel Thornfield, a man whose fortune seemed to materialize as suddenly as his sorrow. He had arrived years earlier, a widower hardened by loss, guiding a single wagon through snow with 7 girls clinging to one another for warmth. His devotion was visible, his resolve admired. He built his store with tireless energy, negotiated deals that others could not. And soon his name became synonymous with success. The mansion on Maple Street rose like a monument, its ornate trim and glowing glass a declaration that hardship could be conquered. Yet prosperity invites attention, and attention breeds suspicion. Some wondered how a merchant moved faster than real money, how contracts fell into his hands so easily. Others noticed the way certain men lingered too long in his store, conversations stopping when someone approached. These thoughts remained unspoken, buried beneath gratitude and awe, until the morning the Thornfield daughters disappeared. The search that followed clawed at the edges of the town and beyond. Pauses scoured forests and ravines, called names that dissolved into wind. Rivers were dragged, trains were questioned, nothing answered. It was as if Selkirk itself refused to give the girls back. Then quietly officials arrived from elsewhere, their presence unannounced and their questions precise. Files were taken, statements rewritten. The investigation turned inward, not toward wilderness, but toward ledgers, rail schedules, and sealed agreements. What emerged was not a single crime, but a pattern, a network hidden beneath commerce and civility, feeding on trust and desperation. Young women were commodities, their futures traded behind closed doors by men who spoke of opportunity and progress. Families were dismantled with paperwork and promises. The frontier had provided cover, and prosperity had paid for silence. The truth of the Thornfield sisters did not end with their disappearance. It spread outward, revealing a machinery of corruption that stretched across territories, sustained by greed and protected by influence. Selkirk had not been cursed by fate or haunted by ghosts. It had been complicit, even if unknowingly, in a darkness that wore the mask of success. Long after the house on Maple Street fell quiet, people claimed to hear footsteps in its halls, the soft rustle of fabric, a breath held too long, windows fogged without warmth behind them. The town tried to forget, but memory has a way of surviving locks and orders. Somewhere in forgotten files and unmarked graves lies the echo of 7 voices, waiting to be heard. This is the gospel of the haunted, where history does not sleep, and every shadow remembers. Gabriel Thornfield's devotion to his daughters became a quiet legend in Selkirk, spoken of with admiration and, increasingly, with unease. Every coin he earned, every connection he forged, seemed guided by a singular purpose: to ensure his 7 daughters would never be swallowed by the hardships that had consumed so many frontier families. They were not raised merely to survive the West, but to shape it, and as they grew, the town watched in awe as each sister became something remarkable, something indispensable, as if Selkirk itself had woven their lives into its own fragile heartbeat. Margaret, the eldest, carried herself with a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her mind moved swiftly, cutting through confusion with calm authority, and nowhere was this more evident than in the small schoolhouse where she taught. Children who once struggled to read or reason found themselves awakened under her guidance, encouraged to question, to think, to understand the world beyond rote repetition. Parents spoke in hushed amazement of how their children came home speaking of ideas instead of lessons, of possibilities instead of limitations. Margaret often stayed long after the lamps were lit, helping those left behind by circumstance, believing knowledge itself was a form of salvation. Catherine, close behind her in age, carried beauty in her hands and sorrow in her eyes. Where others saw wilderness, she saw stories waiting to be revealed. Her canvases captured mountains that seemed to breathe, valleys heavy with memory, faces etched with endurance and quiet pain. Homes and storefronts displayed her work not merely as decoration, but as proof that refinement could survive even here, at the edge of civilization. She gathered the town in candlelit rooms filled with music, poetry and conversation, moments where Selkirk pretended it was more than a mining town clinging to fortune. Yet there was something in Catherine's art that unsettled those who looked too closely, as if she painted not only what existed, but what lingered unseen. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth moved through life like mirrored reflections that never quite aligned. Their fingers worked tirelessly, stitching dresses and suits that transformed raw cloth into symbols of celebration and hope. Their shop became a refuge, a place where women lingered longer than necessary, exchanging whispers beneath the hum of conversation. Eleanor spoke with confidence and ambition, her laughter sharp and contagious, while Elizabeth listened more than she spoke, her silence absorbing secrets like fabric absorbs thread. Many left that shop lighter than they arrived, unaware of how much they had surrendered simply by being heard. Sarah's voice rose each Sunday like a benediction, filling the church with sounds so pure it seemed to cleanse the air itself. She sang not for praise but for connection, weaving together the fractured spirits of a town that endured too much too often. Beyond the hymns, she organized aid for the injured, comforted the grieving, and stood beside widows whose tears had long dried into resignation. Her kindness carried weight, and people leaned on it without realizing how much she carried alone. Grace, still young but already formidable, lived among ledgers and numbers as though they were a second language whispered only to her. She saw patterns others missed, flaws hidden beneath columns of ink, dangers masked as opportunity. Men twice her age paused when she spoke, unsettled by the ease with which she dismantled their assumptions. Gabriel trusted her judgment more than his own, and those who noticed this exchange began to wonder what else Grace might see, what truths her sharp mind might uncover if left unchecked. Rebecca, the youngest, carried light wherever she went. Her laughter broke through the long Montana winters, her presence lifting burdens without effort. In the small library she read to children whose parents labored underground or behind counters, her voice soft but steady, weaving worlds far kinder than the one outside. She listened with genuine care, remembering names, worries, small dreams. Many believed she embodied the future Selkirk hoped for. a gentler chapter waiting to be written. Together, the Thornfield sisters formed something rare, a constellation of talent, compassion, and intellect that shone too brightly to go unnoticed, and noticed they did. Whispers followed the family through the streets. Admiration slowly curdled into suspicion. People began to ask how Gabriel Thornfield had risen so quickly, how wealth had found him when others struggled. Some claimed Eastern financiers stood behind him, others suggested debts paid in ways never recorded. These murmurs grew louder as strangers began arriving on the evening train, men dressed too well for the dust of Selkirk, their eyes sharp, their questions careful. They entered the Thornfield house after dusk and left before dawn, their conversations sealed behind the heavy door of Gabriel's study. The year pressed heavily upon the town. Across the west, the wounds of economic collapse still bled beneath the surface. Minds grew restless as workers demanded dignity instead of expendability. Strikes erupted, sometimes ending in blood, sometimes simply disappearing from the record altogether. Railroads brought prosperity, yes, but they also delivered predators who understood how to exploit isolation, how to disguise cruelty as opportunity. Selkirk stood exposed, its isolation broken, its innocence compromised. Families arrived seeking hope, and others vanished quietly, explained away by ambition or misfortune. The town told itself this was progress. It told itself nothing dark could survive in daylight. But darkness does not need nightfall. It waits patiently, watching, learning routines, memorizing habits. And somewhere within that elegant house on Maple Street, with its stained glass and locked doors, forces far older than the town itself were aligning, drawn by talent, by virtue, by value. The Thornfield sisters did not simply live in Selkirk. They anchored it. And when anchors are cut, what remains does not drift gently. It sinks. And in the Gospel of the Haunted, we remember that some disappearances are not accidents, but offerings made to a system that thrives on silence, where prosperity demands a price and the innocent are always the currency. Along the iron veins of the railroad, darker forces traveled as faithfully as commerce itself. Wherever steel cut through wilderness, opportunists followed, men who thrived on distance from scrutiny and towns still learning the shape of law. Selkirk had heard the rumors long before it understood them. Whispers of smooth-talking strangers, vanished deeds, and families quietly broken apart. The rails brought prosperity, yes, but they also carried hunger, and hunger is never satisfied. The day before everything was lost dawned with deceptive beauty. Autumn had reached its most breathtaking moment, as if the land itself wished to distract those who lived upon it. The maples lining Selkirk streets burned with gold and crimson, their leaves trembling in a breeze that felt clean, hopeful, innocent. Sunlight filtered through branches like stained glass, casting shifting patterns across boardwalks and windows. It was the kind of morning that convinced people the world was kind. Gabriel Thornfield unlocked his store at the same precise moment he always did, the ritual as steady as a heartbeat. Inside, shelves waited in perfect order, ledgers balanced, clocks aligned. Yet something in his posture betrayed unease. His gaze lingered too often on the street, his fingers brushing his watch as if time itself had begun to misbehave. Customers sensed it, though none could name it. The air around him felt taut, stretched thin. Margaret left for the schoolhouse with her satchel tucked against her side, the familiar walk suddenly unfamiliar. Parents waiting with their children noticed the difference immediately. Her smile did not reach her eyes. Her answers came late, as though pulled from somewhere far away. A loose strand of hair escaped her careful arrangement, her collar slightly askew. It was subtle but wrong. Margaret Thornfield was not a woman of disorder, and that small imperfection unsettled those who noticed it. Behind the Thornfield home, Catherine stood before her canvas as she had done so many mornings before, but her brush hesitated. She paced the garden paths, stopped, stared toward the distant line of the tracks, then returned to paint the same fragment again and again. Color layered over color until the image beneath was lost, smothered by indecision. A neighbor watching from across the street later said Catherine looked as though she were waiting for something she dreaded yet could not avoid. At the seamstress shop, the twins worked in near silence. The rhythm of scissors and thread replaced their usual laughter. When customers entered, their murmured conversations died instantly, eyes flicking toward the door before returning to their work. Measurements were taken twice. Then again, fingers trembling just enough to be noticed. Fabric was unstitched and redone, as if perfection had become suddenly impossible. Those who passed through felt it, a tension thick enough to cling to the air. Sarah's voice faltered beneath the church rafters. Notes wavered where they should have soared. She stopped mid-hymn, staring out the windows as though the street beyond held answers she was afraid to hear. When concern was offered, she brushed it away, her smile fragile, her refusal sharp. She would not summon help. She would not explain. Whatever weighed on her heart was hers alone, and it was heavy. In the store, Grace stood beside her father, chalk and ledger before her, yet numbers betrayed her. Totals came wrong, columns blurred. She blinked as if waking from a dream she had not chosen. Gabriel watched her closely, worry flickering behind his eyes, but he said nothing. He too seemed to be listening for something only he could hear. Rebecca moved through the house quietly, helping prepare for the evening, her usual brightness dimmed to a shadow. As she worked alongside the housekeeper, she asked questions that felt too old for her years, questions about distance, about leaving, about whether happiness could survive separation. When answers came, they did not comfort her. They only deepened the worry etched across her young face. As the day wore on, the unease that clung to each sister began to gather, drawing them towards something unseen. By mid-afternoon, they emerged together, walking along River Street toward the depot. A doctor returning from his rounds noticed them at once. He had never seen them like this, all seven moving as one, their steps measured, their silence absolute. Their faces were pale, their expressions set with a determination that felt forced, rehearsed, unnatural. They did not greet passers-by. They did not look at the familiar storefronts or the river glittering beside them. They moved forward as if compelled, as if stopping were no longer an option. The doctor called out, his voice light, an attempt to restore normalcy. Only Rebecca turned. What he saw in her eyes haunted him for the rest of his life. It was not confusion, it was not sadness, it was pure terror. Raw and pleading, locked behind a silence she could not break. For a heartbeat, their gazes held, and in that instant he understood she was asking for help she could not request, begging without words. Then she turned away, swallowed once more by the motion of the group. As twilight approached, the telegraph office clerk glimpsed them near the depot, standing beneath the lengthening shadows, waiting. No luggage, no conversation. Just seven figures poised at the edge of departure, as though the town itself had already released them. That was the last moment Selkirk saw them together. By morning their rooms would be empty, their beds untouched, and the town would begin the long, futile task of pretending it did not know what had been taken from it. Because in the Gospel of the Haunted, we learn that the most terrifying departures are not those marked by screams or struggle, but the ones that happen quietly, in plain sight, while everyone is still telling themselves that everything is fine. The glow of evening settled over Selkirk like a held breath, pooling along the main street and clinging to the wooden sidewalks where residents lingered to finish their business before night fully claimed the town. Inside the telegraph office, the steady scratch of pen against paper filled the quiet, until Timothy Fletcher lifted his eyes toward the window and felt something in his chest tighten without warning. Beneath the amber halo of the street lamp outside stood the 7 Thornfield sisters, gathered so precisely it seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. They were not arranged as family members sharing a moment, nor as young women enjoying the cool night air. They stood in a straight, unyielding line, their bodies angled toward the distant tracks, their focus sharpened to a single, unseen point. The longer Fletcher watched, the more unsettled he became. Their stillness was absolute, so complete that for a fleeting moment he questioned his own sight, wondering if fatigue or lamplight had conjured an illusion. They did not shift their weight or speak, they did not acknowledge the town around them. It was as though Selkirk had ceased to exist, leaving only the station and whatever waited beyond it. Their posture carried tension, a rigid resolve edged with something darker, something that felt like fear braced behind discipline. What troubled him further was their attire. These were not the garments of routine or comfort, not dresses worn for errands or evenings at home. Each sister wore finery reserved for special occasions, fabric chosen with care, hair arranged with deliberate elegance. Jewelry caught the lamplight, glinting softly, pieces Fletcher recognized from church services and public celebrations. It was the kind of preparation that spoke of intention, of an ending or a beginning, but their faces told a different story. No excitement warmed their expressions. No anticipation softened their eyes. Instead, there was resignation, heavy and unmistakable, and beneath it, a fear so tightly controlled it felt rehearsed. Fletcher returned to his work, uneasy but uncertain what to do with the feeling. When he looked up again minutes later, the street outside was empty. The sisters had vanished without sound, without farewell, leaving the lamplight shining on nothing at all. What followed became the most contested hours in Selkirk's memory, clouded by silence and contradictions. Inside the Thornfield house, the only account of the evening belonged to Gabriel himself, and his words would later fray under scrutiny. He claimed to have withdrawn to his study, surrounded by letters and ledgers delivered earlier that day, his mind occupied by routine matters of trade. He spoke of time passing unnoticed, of familiar habits carried out as they always had been. The housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, departed at her usual hour, leaving behind a home that felt wrong to her in ways she could not immediately explain. She later described a quiet that pressed against her ears, deeper than the normal calm of evening. No laughter drifted from the upper floors. No footsteps crossed the halls. Even the house itself seemed subdued, its usual creaks and sighs muted as if the walls were listening. What unsettled her most was the absence of preparation. The sisters were creatures of habit, always arranging clothing, organizing materials, setting small things in order for the coming day. That night, nothing lay ready. It was as if tomorrow no longer mattered. Gabriel stated that he retired at his customary hour, performing his nightly checks, murmuring a prayer in the small chapel room, and closing himself into the bedroom he had occupied alone for so many years. He insisted that sleep came easily, that the night passed without disturbance, that no sound reached him through the thick walls. Yet the house would soon contradict him. Dawn crept into Selkirk beneath a brittle cold, and Mrs. Caldwell returned, her key turning smoothly in the lock. Everything appeared as she had left it, too much so. She stepped inside expecting movement, voices, the gentle chaos of a household beginning its day. Instead, silence engulfed her, heavy and unnatural, swallowing her footsteps whole. It felt less like a home and more like a place abandoned in haste, frozen mid-breath. She called out, her voice sounding foreign in the stillness. Nothing answered. No doors opened above, no laughter echoed. Even the clocks seemed hesitant, their ticking faint and distant. For a moment she convinced herself the family had simply slept late, lulled by the cold or a long evening. But as she moved deeper into the house, unease tightened its grip. Upstairs, doors stood closed, the corridor untouched. When she entered the first bedroom, she felt it immediately. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets smooth, the blankets undisturbed. No impression marked the pillow. The room was immaculate, as if no one had entered or left since the night before. One by one she opened the remaining doors, each revealing the same impossible order. 7 rooms, 7 untouched beds. 7 absences screaming louder than any cry. The sisters' clothing hung neatly in their places. Personal items remained where they had always been. Nothing suggested a hurried departure, no sign of struggle or escape. The windows were latched, the doors locked. The house had not been broken into, it had been emptied. By the time Gabriel was summoned and the authorities alerted, Selkirk was already beginning to change. The story spread faster than the cold, twisting as it moved, settling into the bones of the town. People spoke in hushed tones, replaying the previous evening in their minds, searching for moments they had dismissed too easily. The sight beneath the street lamp, the silence. The fear in Rebecca's eyes that one man would never forget. What happened between night and dawn would remain sealed behind official reports and unanswered questions. But the house knew. The walls remembered, and in the Gospel of the Haunted, we understand that when a place grows suddenly quiet, when lives vanish without disorder, it is not because nothing happened. It is because what happened was done with care, with intention, and with a confidence that no one would dare look too closely afterward. Her unease deepened the moment she reached the kitchen. Mrs. Caldwell paused in the doorway, her breath catching as she took in the familiar space rendered suddenly alien. Each evening, without fail, the sisters gathered here as night settled over Selkirk. Tea Tea would be brewed, bread sliced, quiet laughter exchanged as plans were made for the coming day. It was ritual, comforting and unbroken. Yet this morning the kitchen looked untouched, as pristine as she had left it the night before. No cups out of place, no crumbs on the table, no lingering warmth in the stove. It was as if time itself had skipped over the room, refusing to acknowledge that night had ever passed. A slow chill crept through her, the kind that has nothing to do with cold. She climbed the main staircase, each step echoing too loudly in the unnatural stillness. The second-floor corridor greeted her like a corridor in a mausoleum. Doors that should have been ajar stood closed, sealed in silence. She knocked softly on Margaret's door, already dreading the answer she would not receive. When no voice replied, she turned the handle with trembling fingers. The room beyond was immaculate. Too immaculate. Margaret's bed was perfectly made, its lines sharp and orderly, untouched by sleep. The pillows lay exactly as they always had, the coverlet stretched smooth and tight. Her nightdress hung neatly by the window, unmoved. Books rested on the dressing table beside lesson plans prepared for a day that would never come. At first glance it appeared as though Margaret had never gone to bed at all. But Mrs. Caldwell knew this room better than almost anyone, and she sensed the wrongness immediately. Objects were aligned, yes, but not with Margaret's exacting precision. Papers had been disturbed, examined, then returned without understanding. Books had been shifted, their order subtly altered. Someone had been here, touching, searching, pretending to know a system they did not fully grasp. Catherine's room told a story just as disturbing, though in a different language. Where chaos usually reigned, there was now suffocating order, brushes cleaned and aligned, paints sealed, canvases stacked carefully against the wall. Catherine had never worked this way. Her creativity spilled across every surface, half-finished visions left where inspiration abandoned them. This version of her room felt staged, as if someone had attempted to erase her presence by forcing it into neatness. The bed, like Margaret's, bore no trace of rest. The twins' shared room shattered any remaining hope. Eleanor and Elizabeth had always arranged their belongings in mirrored symmetry, every drawer and shelf reflecting the other. That harmony was broken. Drawers had been opened, rifled through, then closed again incorrectly. Clothing folded with care, but not with their care. The attempt at restoration and only emphasized the violation. Someone had searched this room thoroughly, carefully, yet without the intimate knowledge that comes from living inside a space day after day. Mrs. Caldwell felt her legs weaken as she climbed higher. By the time she reached the third floor, dread had become certainty. Sarah's room offered the same impossible stillness. Grace's showed signs of careful disturbance, ledgers shifted, papers examined. Rebecca's room, once alive with warmth and youthful clutter, stood frozen, her bed untouched, her nightdress still waiting where she had left it. Everywhere, the same message repeated without words. They had not slept here. They had not left in haste, and yet they were gone. The scream tore from Mrs. Caldwell's throat before she realized she was capable of it. It echoed through the house, through the halls that had held so much life only hours before. She fled into the street, her cries cutting through the calm of morning, drawing neighbors from their homes. The words tumbled out of her, fractured and frantic. The girls were gone, all of them. Something terrible had happened. Gabriel Thornfield emerged amid the commotion, disbelief etched across his face. He pushed past the gathering crowd, demanding explanations that could not be given. Inside the house, he ran from room to room, calling his daughters names, clinging to the hope that this was some elaborate misunderstanding. Each doorway crushed that hope further. 7 beds untouched, 7 rooms disturbed with deliberate care, evidence not of chaos but of control. Sheriff Harding arrived quickly, his expression grim as he crossed the threshold. He had faced theft, violence, drunken brawls, the crude crimes of frontier life. Nothing prepared him for this. The house offered no broken locks, no shattered glass, no signs of struggle. Instead, it presented a puzzle of chilling sophistication. Someone had moved freely through every floor, examined belongings, read papers, touched lives, and then departed without leaving a mark obvious enough to follow. Harding moved slowly, his eyes sharp, his instincts uneasy. He recognized method when he saw it. This was not the work of a desperate intruder or a crime of passion. It was calculated. planned, executed by someone who knew the house or someone guided carefully through it. The absence of violence did not comfort him. It terrified him. As word spread, Selkirk changed. Doors closed, conversations lowered. The town felt small and exposed. People replayed the previous day in their minds, the strange behavior, the silence beneath the street lamp, the fear glimpsed in a young girl's eyes. Too many details aligned too late. The Thornfield house stood open to the morning light, yet it felt sealed shut, holding secrets that would not speak easily. And in the gospel of the haunted, we understand that some horrors are not announced with blood or noise. They arrive quietly, leaving behind perfect order, empty rooms, and a question that will echo longer than any scream. Because when someone takes the time to search every corner of a life before erasing it, they are not acting in haste. They are acting with purpose. Caldwell's presence within the Thornfield house did not bring clarity. It brought dread. Every observation he recorded seemed to peel away another layer of comfort, replacing it with a deeper, colder uncertainty. He walked the hall slowly, his eyes tracing doorframes, hinges, locks, as if expecting the house itself to confess. But it offered only silence. Every door was secured from the inside. Every window rested in its latch, untouched, unforced, unmoved. There were no splinters, no scratches, no signs of desperate hands or hurried escape. The front entrance, the rear threshold, both remained exactly as they had been sealed the night before, as though the house had willingly kept its secrets. Outside, the earth told a story by refusing to tell one at all. The soil surrounding the foundation was soft from recent moisture, the kind that remembers everything that crosses it. Yet there were no footprints, no marks of boots or bare feet, no paths leading away into the dark. Anyone entering or leaving during the night would have written their passage clearly into the ground, but the earth lay smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing living had passed over it. The absence was not natural. It felt deliberate, controlled. As the investigation deepened, Harding began to understand that whatever had happened was neither random nor rushed. Each bedroom revealed the same unsettling truth. Belongings had been handled, but not by loving hands. Drawers were opened, their contents examined, then returned with an unfamiliar order that mimicked care without understanding it. Dresses were unfolded and refolded, sleeves aligned imperfectly. Jewelry boxes were opened, rings and chains inspected, then placed back without reverence. Letters had been read, pages touched, secrets scanned, yet nothing was taken. Gold lay untouched. Money remained where it had always been hidden. Tokens of memory, worthless to anyone else, still waited patiently in their places. The search had not been for valuables. It had been for something else. Harding carried this unease beyond the Thornfield home and into Selkirk itself. He spoke to shopkeepers, laborers, boarding house owners, rail workers, anyone whose memory might still be sharp enough to recall the night of October's turning. What he uncovered was not a single clue, but a pattern of discomfort that had been growing quietly for months. People described strange tensions they could not name, conversations that ended abruptly, glances exchanged and quickly withdrawn. The town had felt watched, not haunted but observed. Several residents mentioned the strangers. Men who arrived on evening trains dressed far too well for a frontier town, their coats cut with Eastern precision, their boots polished beyond necessity. They carried expensive leather cases and moved with purpose, never lingering, never socializing. They met privately with respected figures, doors closing softly behind them, voices lowered. By morning they were gone, leaving behind no stories, no purchases, no laughter shared over drinks. Their refusal to engage felt unnatural in a place where strangers were usually absorbed, questioned, welcomed. These men had not come to belong. They had come to conduct business. The telegraph office confirmed what whispers alone could not prove. Messages had been flowing out of Selkirk in unusual volume, sent late at night, encoded in strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to the operators who tapped them out. Destinations stretched across the nation, names of cities heavy with influence and power. The clerk who last saw the sisters alive admitted that many of these messages were sent by Gabriel Thornfield himself, his posture rigid as he dictated words that refused to make sense. Others followed, names respected, faces trusted, all reaching eastward with secrets wrapped in code. When Harding turned his attention to the town's finances, resistance hardened. The bank president hesitated, deflected, delayed. But truth has weight, and persistence eventually cracks even the strongest vaults. Records revealed withdrawals of gold so large they drained more than coin. They drained credibility. These transactions clustered tightly around the visits of the well-dressed strangers, as though money itself was being summoned on command. Even more troubling were the deposits. Payments arriving from distant sources, swelling accounts beyond what any general store could justify. Selkirk prospered, yes, but this was something else. This was excess. This was compensation. As autumn surrendered to winter, the disappearance refused to fade. It spread instead, carried by newspapers and rumor alike, gripping the nation's imagination. Artists sketched the missing sisters with hopeful eyes. Theories bloomed and rotted in print. And then the federal government arrived, quiet and methodical, led by a man who had seen what happened when crime learned to wear respectability. Inspector Reed did not chase ghosts. He followed paper, money, patterns that stretched beyond town borders and moral comfort. What he uncovered did not stop at Selkirk, nor did it end with one family. It revealed a web of transactions, claims exchanged, contracts signed in shadow, fortunes built on silence. Gabriel Thornfield's rise aligned too perfectly with these movements to be coincidence. His wealth echoed the rhythm of a larger machine, one that consumed opportunity and produced obedience. And somewhere within that machinery, 7 young lives had been catalogued, assessed, and removed. Not stolen in panic, not taken by force, but selected. Because in the Gospel of the Haunted, we learn that the most terrifying evil does not break doors or leave footprints. It studies, it calculates, and when it is finished searching your life, it closes everything neatly behind it and leaves the house standing empty and waiting to be remembered. The deeper the federal inquiry reached, the more it uncovered a landscape of influence that felt less like governance and more like a carefully tended infestation. Records pointed toward appointments made quietly, favors exchanged without ceremony, and authority granted not through merit but through obedience. Yet, even these revelations paled beside the name that surfaced again and again like a stain that could not be scrubbed away: the Rocky Mountain Development Company. A title polished enough to sound respectable, benign even, but one that carried a weight of unease wherever it appeared. Its fingerprints were scattered across Montana and far beyond, embedded in deeds, contracts, and vanished claims, all acquired through methods so deliberately obscured that local officials were rendered helpless, reduced to witnesses of their own irrelevance. To those who pursued it, the company behaved like a shadow with many edges. It never appeared directly. Instead, it moved through layers of false fronts and borrowed identities, a labyrinth of smaller entities designed to fracture responsibility and dissolve accountability. Each path led to another dead end, another name that meant nothing, another office that closed just before questions arrived. Money flowed freely, without origin or explanation, an endless river feeding projects that reshaped the West while leaving no single hand visible at the source. Reed understood then that this was not merely corruption, this was design. What could be proven, slowly and painfully, was the company's hunger for control. Mineral rights, rail access, land poised for future expansion, all drawn into its orbit. Deals were struck behind curtains, with respected citizens accepting payments that felt like rewards but functioned as shackles. Cooperation was purchased, silence ensured. And woven into this web was Gabriel Thornfield, his name appearing in correspondence shortly after his arrival in Selkirk, when he was still a stranger with too many daughters and too few resources. The funds he received transformed his modest venture into something far larger than circumstance should have allowed. Prosperity bloomed overnight, but it was prosperity with strings. In return, Gabriel became a conduit. His reports detailed the pulse of the town, the veins of silver beneath its soil, the loyalties and weaknesses of those who held power. He offered maps not just of land, but of people. Winter descended as these truths emerged, and the frantic search for the sisters cooled into something quieter, heavier. A case that would not close, but would no longer move. Selkirk itself seemed to feel the shift. Suspicion settled into daily life like ash after a fire, coating conversations, eroding trust. Families began to leave, citing opportunity elsewhere, but their departures carried the unmistakable weight of fear. Others arrived in their place, strangers untouched by grief, uninterested in old questions. The town's memory fractured. Gabriel withdrew from sight, a ghost moving between stone walls and headstones. In the cemetery he raised 7 markers, pristine and pale, bearing names without bodies, grief without proof. He visited them often, standing in silence as if listening for answers that would never rise from the ground. The store that once anchored Selkirk changed hands. New owners swept away the past along with the ledgers, unaware or unwilling to know what had funded those shelves. Records vanished, burned or removed, leaving behind only gaps where explanations should have been. In the Thornfield mansion, traces of the sisters were boxed away, lifted into the attic like relics from a life no longer spoken aloud. Their art disappeared from walls. Their words faded from programs and gatherings. Even their names grew unfamiliar, spoken less often, then rarely, then almost never. By the time spring returned, Selkirk was no longer the same place. Those who remembered had gone, carrying their suspicions with them. What remained was a settlement of ambition, populated by individuals focused forward, not back, careful not to disturb foundations that might collapse beneath scrutiny. The transformation mirrored something larger unfolding across the West, where the promise of freedom and fairness was being hollowed out by forces that viewed land as inventory and lives as expendable variables. Years passed, silence hardened, and then decades later, the past breathed again. In a forgotten corner of Chicago, a warehouse scheduled for demolition yielded a secret it had guarded with brick and false walls. Behind them lay a room untouched by time, its air stale with secrecy. Filing cabinets stood like sentinels. Boxes overflowed with documents that mapped an enterprise unbound by law or conscience. The story they told spanned years of exploitation, names changed and reused, lives catalogued and consumed. Among the artifacts were photographs, 7 of them. Small, precise, professional, they depicted the Thornfield sisters not as they had been remembered, but as they had become. Each image was paired with meticulous notes describing temperament, aptitude, adaptability. Not memories, assessments, the kind made when a human being is no longer seen as a person. The most chilling detail lay in their faces. They were older, time had passed for them somewhere else. Margaret's gaze carried the gravity of responsibility, a woman shaped by years that Selkirk had never witnessed. Catherine wore finery that spoke of wealth, but her eyes told a different story, one of loss carefully concealed beneath elegance. The realization struck like a delayed scream. These images were taken after the night the town had declared them gone. The gospel of the haunted teaches us that some disappearances are not endings. They are relocations, transfers, and the horror is not that the world forgets, but that it remembers too late. Because while Selkirk moved on, the machine kept working, and somewhere in the spaces between photographs and ledgers, 7 lives continued, reshaped by forces that never needed to break a door to take what they wanted. The photographs did not show the girls as Selkirk had known them. They showed what time had done after the night they vanished, after the doors stayed locked and the beds remained untouched. Eleanor and Elizabeth appeared in separate frames, no longer mirrored reflections but distinct women shaped by distance and division. Their shared face had fractured into subtle differences, a tightened jaw here, a wary gaze there, the quiet evidence of years spent apart, learning survival without each other. It was as if the bond that once made them inseparable had been deliberately unstitched, thread by thread, until only resemblance remained. Sarah's image carried a different weight. She stood in clothing that suggested duty and discipline, the uniform of service, charity, or faith, but her eyes betrayed something far heavier. There was a sadness there that could not be posed or coached away, a resignation that spoke of promises made and quietly revoked. It was the look of someone who had continued forward because stopping was never permitted. Grace appeared older than memory allowed, dressed like a woman whose mind was put to use for others' gain. The brightness that once defined her was dimmed, not extinguished, but dulled by repetition, control, and the slow erosion of curiosity. Rebecca's photograph cut deepest of all. She was beautiful, composed, perfectly arranged, yet utterly hollow. The laughter that once filled rooms was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt practiced, as if joy itself had become a liability. When Detective John Sullivan examined the images, he did not see relics of a cold case. He saw inventory. He recognized the markings of organized exploitation, the careful documentation of lives reduced to assets. The warehouse archive revealed a system that cloaked itself in gentle language, calling its operations placement and opportunity, advancement and care. In truth, it was a machine that fed on isolation. It thrived in places where families stood alone against distance, poverty, and hope stretched thin by geography. The records detailed a strategy perfected over decades. Frontier towns were mapped and measured, their vulnerabilities catalogued with clinical precision. Communities with limited law enforcement, families burdened by debt or ambition, parents fearful that their daughters' futures would be smaller than their dreams. These were the targets. The organization wore many masks, presenting itself as employment agencies, educational benefactors, matrimonial brokers, and charitable societies. Each front looked respectable, each invitation sounded reasonable, each promise felt like rescue. Their emissaries arrived dressed in refinement, speaking of cities where opportunity flowed freely, and of institutions eager to elevate promising young women. They carried letters stamped with authority, names that impressed, credentials that soothed suspicion. They spoke gently to parents about futures beyond dust and isolation, about lives unbound by the limits of the frontier. And once interest was sparked, the web tightened. Investments were suggested. Partnerships proposed. Obligations layered carefully until withdrawal felt impossible, even dangerous. Every family was studied. Financial strain, social aspiration, fear of stagnation, all were leveraged. The organization adjusted its approach with chilling adaptability, offering exactly what was needed to secure compliance. By the time the final stage arrived, resistance had been softened into acceptance. Daughters were told they were chosen. Families were told their children had decided for themselves. Distance was framed as independence. Silence was explained as progress. Sullivan's investigation traced this pattern back through countless towns, but the Thornfield case revealed something far more personal. The correspondence hidden in the archive showed that Gabriel Thornfield's involvement had begun years before Selkirk noticed anything amiss. Shortly after his arrival in Montana, letters appeared between him and figures whose names shifted, but whose intent remained constant. They had financed his ascent, inflated his success, and in return, he had become their eyes and ears. At first, his role was small. Observations, introductions, quiet assurances that certain families were respectable, pliable, suitable. Over time, his usefulness grew, and with it, his dependence. The support he received became essential, the obligations binding. The letters revealed a man slowly enclosed, each favor answered with another demand. As federal scrutiny intensified and suspicion spread through Selkirk, Gabriel's position became perilous. He knew too much. He was seen too often. Risk had replaced value. The final correspondence was the most disturbing. It showed a man unraveling beneath the weight of what was required of him. The organization no longer wanted his information. They wanted settlement, compensation. The daughters he loved had become currency in a ledger that never acknowledged mercy. Gabriel's words grew frantic, his justifications hollow even to himself. He wrote of love and necessity in the same breath, of sacrifice framed as inevitability. He understood too late that there would be no alternative offered. The archive ended there, not with confession, but with silence. The machine had no need to document what came next. The photographs were proof enough. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we learn that the most enduring terror is not born of sudden violence, but of systems designed to consume quietly. Evil that does not shout, but whispers assurances, that does not force entry, but is invited inside. The sisters were not taken in chaos. They were transferred with care, their lives rerouted through corridors built long before Selkirk ever existed, and somewhere between promises and paperwork, 7 young women were erased from one world and absorbed into another. Their absence explained away, their survival repurposed, their voices sealed behind walls that would not crumble until decades had passed. By the time the truth emerged, the frontier had moved on. The machine had evolved, and the echo of that night remained lingering not in the locked house, but in the knowledge that sometimes the door never opens because it was never meant to, because when horror wears the mask of opportunity, it does not need chains, only consent. What haunted Gabriel Thornfield most was not the act itself, but the certainty of what would happen if he refused. The organization never needed to shout its threats. They were delivered softly, wrapped in polite language and carefully chosen consequences. A store that would suddenly fail, legal troubles that would appear from nowhere, accidents whispered about but never proven, friends who would turn away. A town that would close its doors to him and leave his family exposed to forces far more brutal than poverty. The message was always the same, delivered with chilling calm: cooperate and survive, resist and watch everything you love be erased piece by piece. In the private pages of his correspondence, Gabriel's despair unfolded slowly, each letter darker than the last. He searched desperately for another path, one narrow enough to slip through unseen. He offered more money, sums that would have ruined him completely. He proposed introducing other families, convincing himself that spreading the harm might somehow lessen it. He even begged for permission to flee, to take his daughters far away to a place beyond the reach of rail lines and strangers in fine coats. Every proposal was rejected without hesitation. The answer never changed. There would be no substitutes, no delays, no mercy. The debt would be settled only when his daughters were surrendered. The final letters revealed a man hollowed out by inevitability. He no longer argued. He pleaded only with himself. He wrote of hope, clinging to the idea that survival might still be possible, that his daughters might endure whatever awaited them, and someday understand the impossible choice he had made. He was promised comfort for them, stability, marriages arranged into wealth and status, lives far removed from the hardships of the frontier. These assurances were offered not as kindness, but as anesthesia, dulling the pain just enough to ensure compliance. Gabriel clung to those promises like a prayer spoken in a void. What followed did not end with Selkirk. The discovery of the correspondence and the hidden archive sent tremors through law enforcement across the nation. The Thornfield sisters were no longer an isolated tragedy. They were proof of a system that had flourished in silence, devouring families while presenting itself as progress. Investigators began uncovering echoes of the same pattern scattered across the West, towns bound together by loss they had never been able to name. As federal agents traced the organization's reach, the scale of corruption revealed itself slowly, then all at once. Judges who dismissed cases with practiced indifference, sheriffs who discouraged grieving parents with warnings and threats, officials who accepted envelopes and favors in exchange for forgetting names. Even offices far from the frontier bore fingerprints of the machine, their authority used to shield a business built on human lives. Those who preached virtue by day had trafficked daughters by night, wrapping exploitation in patriotic language and civic pride. The records told a grim story of efficiency. Young women catalogued and evaluated, strengths noted, weaknesses exploited. Intelligence, beauty, obedience, resilience, all weighed like commodities. Entire communities had been studied from afar, their struggles mapped, their desperation calculated. The expansion of railroads had transformed distance into opportunity for the organization, allowing victims to vanish across states before families even realized something was wrong. Isolation and slow communication ensured that questions arrived long after the trails had gone cold. The enterprise thrived because it understood human hope. It offered parents a vision brighter than the lives they knew, futures polished enough to blind them to risk. By the time doubts surfaced, commitments had already been made. Pride, fear, and obligation locked families into silence. And when the girls were gone, explanations followed, swiftly, crafted to sound reasonable, even admirable. Independence, ambition, a better life elsewhere. Lies repeated often enough to harden into accepted truth. In Selkirk, the revelations fractured what remained of the town's soul. Some demanded accountability, their grief reignited by the knowledge that the disappearance had never been random. Others recoiled in fear, understanding that the truth threatened livelihoods, reputations, and fragile prosperity. Too many had benefited from Gabriel's success, from the investments and growth tied to the same shadowed network. To pursue justice now meant admitting complicity, or at least willful blindness. Whispers turned into accusation. The mayor's silence no longer seemed innocent. The banker's generosity carried a new weight. Merchants who had discouraged questions year earlier found their motives scrutinized under a harsher light. Payments made to quiet rumors resurfaced as evidence. Deals once framed as civic responsibility were exposed as bribes. The town had not merely failed the Thornfield sisters. It had participated, passively or actively, in the lie that swallowed them. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we learn that the most devastating betrayals are not sudden acts of cruelty, but long negotiations with fear. They are built slowly, agreement by agreement, silence by silence, until resistance feels impossible and guilt becomes routine. Selkirk did not wake one morning to discover evil at its door. It welcomed it in pieces, because it promised prosperity, stability, and protection from harsher truths. The machine did not need monsters. It relied on ordinary people choosing comfort over conscience. And when the daughters were gone, when the doors remained locked and the beds untouched, the town chose forgetting over reckoning. Because horror does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it signs contracts, sometimes it smiles, and sometimes it asks a father to decide which future he is willing to destroy, then waits patiently while he convinces himself there is no other choice. The true horror in Selkirk revealed itself long after the town had tried to forget. When investigators turned to the records of the local cemetery, what appeared at first glance to be ordinary memorials became a revelation that shook the very foundations of the Thornfield tragedy. Gabriel's 7 marble headstones, monuments erected with solemn devotion, carried a secret that transformed their purpose from remembrance to confession. The dates inscribed on the stone were not markers of death, as the town had assumed, but silent records of the days his daughters were forcibly married in distant cities, stripped of agency and placed into lives they had not chosen. Each engraving, each carved numeral, was a quiet witness to the horror that had been hidden behind the veil of mystery, a father's acknowledgement of the fates forced upon those he had failed to protect. Gabriel had known. He had always known. And the choice he made to preserve the illusion of disappearance rather than confront the machinery that had ensnared his family revealed the depth of the moral catastrophe that had consumed him. His silence had been protection, a desperate attempt to shield others from the same fate, yet it also made him complicit. A victim of circumstance, yes, but also an unwilling participant in a design that demanded obedience to cruelty. When his body was later found in Denver, his suicide note revealed the anguish that had consumed him, madness born of guilt, a knowledge that he had held the keys to freedom but lacked the courage to use them. The federal investigation, already widening across states and decades, uncovered that the organization responsible for the sisters' disappearance had never truly ceased its operation. By 1922, it had adapted to a changing America, transforming into an elaborate network of legitimate-looking employment agencies, matrimonial services, and social organizations. Its methods were refined, almost elegant in their predation, moving from isolated frontier towns to immigrant communities, rural families displaced by economic upheaval, and struggling urban households. Vulnerability remained their target. Poverty, isolation, ambition, trust, all exploited with surgical precision. The machinery of oppression had simply shifted form, trading frontier isolation for modern anonymity, while maintaining the same cold efficiency. A coordinated series of raids in the spring of 1922, spanning 12 states and involving over 200 federal agents, finally began unraveling the threads that had entangled the Thornfield sisters and countless others. The raids revealed women still held in conditions of forced compliance, evidence of lives long distorted by manipulation, deception, and terror. Yet the files uncovered also told the detailed stories of those who had been taken decades earlier, allowing investigators to trace the true paths of the Thornfield daughters. The cold reality of each life, meticulously recorded by their captors, now lay bare. Margaret Thornfield had been sent to Cleveland, compelled into marriage with a steel mill magnate who sought a bride of intelligence and refinement to complement his status. Promises of social prestige and educational opportunities had masked her true role, a carefully controlled possession, silenced, monitored, and forbidden any contact with her family. She bore children who were told she was an orphan. Every attempt to escape had been blocked by the intricate network that had taken root across the country, ensuring that the girls remained unreachable and the truth invisible. Living under the name Mary Patterson, Margaret had quietly documented her captivity, recording evidence of the criminal enterprise she had been unwillingly made part of, leaving a trail for those who would later seek justice. Catherine's experience followed a different, yet equally cruel pattern. Sent to Milwaukee, she was married to an art collector who exploited her talents for profit and prestige. Isolated from communities that might have provided support, her works were co-opted, sold under another name, and her creativity harnessed to serve the very individuals who had imprisoned her. Catherine, now Caroline Phillips, endured her psychological torment through her art, pouring grief, longing, and desperation onto canvas, while the watchful eyes of her captor ensured she could not reach safety. Each painting became a silent testament to resilience and suffering, an unspoken plea for recognition that only the investigators of 1922 could finally answer. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were separated, photographed individually, their once identical features now showing subtle divergences, evidence of lives lived apart, shaped by the pressures of forced obedience, manipulation, and the slow erosion of autonomy. Each sister bore marks of resilience and trauma, hidden behind appearances that suggested prosperity and security, while in truth they were living under constant surveillance, subject to the will of strangers who had traded human life as though it were merchandise. Sarah, Grace, and Rebecca, too, endured arrangements that robbed them of freedom and joy, each a carefully maintained secret, a record of calculated cruelty, a life rewritten without consent. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we understand that evil does not always strike with noise. It does not always leave shattered doors or broken locks. Often it arrives quietly, masquerading as opportunity, as protection, as advancement. It signs contracts, takes photographs, and records every transaction meticulously, ensuring compliance without the need for force. And sometimes it asks a father to make a choice, to weigh the impossible against the unimaginable, and to convince himself that the future he destroys is the only one he can save. Selkirk's story was not merely one of disappearance, but of methodical subjugation, a web that spanned decades, states, and families. The machine of exploitation adapted, modernized, and continued, while the echoes of that October night lingered in locked houses, in silent cemeteries, and in the quiet knowledge that some evils are most terrifying not because they scream, but because they wait patiently for someone to agree to their terms, because sometimes horror does not arrive. Sometimes it simply signs the papers, smiles, and watches, as lives vanish into histories that only the brave or the foolish dare to uncover. The Thornfield sisters' fate, once shrouded in mystery, finally emerged through courage, persistence, and the patient unraveling of decades-long deception. And yet, the legacy of that night, the quiet complicity, the silent arrangements, the contracts that bound fathers, towns, and law remains a caution whispered through the pages of history. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we see that the truest terror is not in the act itself, but in the consent we give, the choices we believe we must make, and the lives that vanish while the world pretends to look away. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been torn apart deliberately, a calculated move designed to shatter the bond that had always sustained them. Eleanor was sent to St. Louis, placed with Marcus Whitfield, a businessman who sought a wife capable of managing his household and social obligations with cold, precise efficiency. The separation from her sister carved a wound into Eleanor's psyche that festered swiftly, transforming grief into a collapse of the mind. Within months, she had ceased to exist as the vibrant young woman Selkirk had known. The frontier's promise of independence and promise had been replaced by an endless void of obedience and despair. Elizabeth, torn from Eleanor, found herself in Chicago, handed over to Samuel Henderson, a banker who prized her industrious nature but had no interest in her thoughts, her feelings, her humanity. The sister who had once carried laughter in her voice and a spark in her eyes now moved through life in silent fear, her existence defined by caution, submission, and the constant dread of consequences for even the smallest transgression. To each twin, the organization whispered the same cruel lie: their sister had died. No hope, no letters, no possibility of reunion, only the cold certainty of isolation, designed to break their spirits and ensure compliance. It was methodical, precise cruelty, the sort of deliberate calculation that left scars deeper than any visible wound. Sarah's story, however, revealed the insidious nature of this system in the most devastating terms. She had been sent to Detroit, married to Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a man who claimed piety and devotion but wielded her musical gifts and religious training as instruments of control. She performed for church congregations and social gatherings, always under his watchful eyes, her talents exploited as trophies rather than celebrated as gifts. Official records claimed she died of pneumonia in 1905, but the truth whispered something darker. Years of relentless emotional and physical torment had left her body fragile, her defenses eroded, her death facilitated by neglect. Morrison had viewed her passing not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to request another bride, to continue the enterprise of control. Grace's intellect had made her a commodity. Sent to Chicago to serve Theodore Blackstone, she was forced into a life of mathematical labor that underpinned fraudulent schemes and money laundering operations. Isolated from the world, denied human connection, she attempted small acts of defiance, subtle errors, tiny cracks in Blackstone's carefully constructed financial empire. Each resistance was punished with a severity that bent her body, spirit, and health. When she died in 1909, alone in childbirth, the organization's cruelty had ensured that even death was a demonstration of power, her life measured not in years or experiences, but in utility, value, and obedience. Rebecca, the youngest, endured the cruelest limbo. Deemed unready for placement, she was shuffled between facilities for years, her days a blur of forced labor and isolation, her growth stunted by constant relocation and relentless psychological torment. By the time she might have been useful to the organization, her health had deteriorated beyond marketable value. She died in 1907, succumbing to tuberculosis in a facility that was nothing more than a warehouse for those no longer useful, a place where hope came to die. The revelation of these fates, pieced together through the painstaking work of federal investigators, unraveled decades of deception. When the arrests of 1922 brought Marcus Peyton, the architect of the trafficking network, to trial, the nation was forced to confront a horror that had silently operated for 40 years. Peyton's mansion, raided in dramatic fashion, revealed mountains of documentation, evidence of wealth, influence, and the systematic corruption of officials across state lines. He spoke with pride, devoid of remorse, portraying his crimes as a kind of service, a business that provided valuable opportunities to those naive enough to trust. He was a man who had converted human lives into currency, who measured success in obedience and profit, who viewed morality as a negotiable detail rather than a standard. Court observers, hardened by years of exposure to criminality, recoiled at his lack of empathy, the precision with which he described arranging marriages, breaking bonds, and reshaping futures. He had engineered a system where grief was predictable, obedience guaranteed, and resistance crushed before it could begin. And yet, Peyton was only the surface of a much deeper corruption. Governors, legislators, judges, bankers, and prominent merchants had all played their parts, turning their offices into instruments of concealment, their silence into complicity, their wealth into a shield for an enterprise that trafficked innocence as though it were an ordinary commodity. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of young women, each chosen for beauty, talent, and family circumstances that rendered them valuable, had been transported across state lines, shuffled through cities and towns, separated from everything familiar. The expansion of railroads, the isolation of frontier towns, the limitations of communication all became tools in the hands of those who preyed upon hope, ambition, and trust. In Selkirk itself, the revelation of these crimes tore the community in two. Some demanded justice, others feared the consequences of digging into the complicity that had enriched their town. Economies, reputations, and livelihoods hung in the balance even as the truth clawed its way into daylight. And so, the silent machinery continued. Contracts signed with smiles, fates traded in ink and ledger, obedience demanded without chains. The Thornfield sisters were gone, their lives altered beyond recognition, their suffering documented in meticulous records and photographs, yet the lessons of their tragedy lingered quietly. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we understand that true horror is never loud. It does not always demand a door to be broken. Often it waits patiently, calculating every step, ensuring compliance, and leaving the world to believe that it has simply moved on. Because sometimes the most terrifying evil is the one that asks a father to choose, convinces a community to look away, and quietly reshapes the lives of the innocent, while the streets remain calm. and the sun continues to rise over a town that has forgotten to notice what it has lost. Because horror does not always arrive with screams. It can slip in quietly, behind polite manners and well-tended gardens, through smiles and letters and the careful folding of promises. It thrives in silence, in the spaces where people assume safety exists. And in Selkirk, in the years that followed the Thornfield sisters' disappearance, the truth waited patiently, buried beneath the neat facades of prosperity, the polite laughter of neighbors, the clink of silver coins that had changed hands under contracts none dared read too closely. Gabriel Thornfield became a ghost in his own home, wandering through corridors lined with marble headstones that did not mark death, but something far more insidious: compliance. Each stone recorded a date, not of mourning but of surrender, a hidden chronicle of each daughter's life transferred to strangers who understood obedience better than love. He had known, he had written it in stone, and yet, for years, he preserved the illusion of mystery, the whisper of disappearance, because to speak the truth would have meant unleashing horrors upon other families, dragging innocent lives into the shadow that had claimed his own. His final letters, discovered years later, showed a man frayed to his core, torn between paternal instinct and the cold arithmetic of threats that promised annihilation for refusal. He had bargained, he had offered wealth, recruits, relocation. All denied. Only the daughters, delivered as commodities, could satisfy the organization's demands. And so he chose, and the world assumed a disappearance. The organization itself, as investigators uncovered, had evolved. It had shed its frontier guise and moved into cities with the same predatory precision, dressed now as employment agencies, matrimonial services, social clubs, charities. Its methods had been refined, polished, wrapped in civility, yet beneath the velvet, the machinery of exploitation continued unabated. They sought the vulnerable, the isolated, the hopeful, turning dreams into instruments of control, ambition into chains. They understood that power often lies not in violence, but in consent shaping expectation, dangling opportunity, and letting the mind supply the willing surrender. The federal raids of 1922 revealed the chilling scope of the operation. Over 200 agents descended across 12 states, uncovering women still living in conditions of enforced compliance, documenting hundreds more whose lives had been rerouted, stolen, repurposed for profit and status. Margaret Thornfield, forced into marriage with Harrison Pembroke in Cleveland, had her intellect and ambition co-opted to maintain the facade of a respectable life. She bore children, yet was forbidden to claim her past, forbidden even to name herself truthfully. Her journals, hidden in secret drawers, revealed acts of quiet resistance, notations, observations, small ways to preserve identity against the systematic erasure of her being. Catherine's artistry, stolen and repackaged as property of Augustus Richardson in Milwaukee, told the story of anguish more vividly than words ever could. Her canvases bore the brushstrokes of genius, yet the colors carried the weight of sorrow, the heavy shadow of surveillance and isolation. She had been forced into compliance, yet had sought refuge in creation, shaping private worlds where her grief, her memory, her selfhood could breathe, however briefly. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been deliberately separated, a cruel calculus to shatter bonds and render obedience absolute. Eleanor, placed in St. Louis with Marcus Whitfield, collapsed into madness within months. The weight of loss, of forced servitude, of quiet terror had consumed her. Elizabeth, sent to Chicago under Samuel Henderson, survived, but as a shadow of herself, fragile, fearful, her spirit bent to the mechanics of control. Lies had been whispered to each. The other was dead, a fiction so poisonous it left them isolated, obedient, convinced escape was impossible. Sarah had been exploited by Reverend Jonathan Morrison, forced to perform in the service of piety that masked cruelty. She died quietly, officially of pneumonia, yet the truth was that a body weakened by relentless abuse, denied care, succumbed under orchestrated neglect, had been used to manipulate money, her intellect a weapon pressed into service for criminal schemes. Her repeated acts of subtle sabotage were punished with precision, until her health and spirit broke, until her death in childbirth was another demonstration of the organization's reach and indifference. Rebecca, youngest, endured prolonged confinement, shifted between holding facilities, her youth spent under surveillance and control. Years of instability, of denied familial contact, eroded her strength, her resilience, until tuberculosis claimed her in a cell-like institution that had no purpose but to hold those no longer useful, to vanish the inconvenient, the too fragile, the inconveniently alive. The public reckoning following the 1922 arrests exposed more than the Thornfields tragedy. The operations of Marcus Peyton, the mastermind, revealed a criminal network intertwined with politicians, judges, bankers, and merchants, men who spoke of virtue while profiting from destruction, who hid behind office and ceremony while orchestrating the lives of the innocent like pieces on a board. Peyton, calm, precise, unrepentant, described his enterprise with pride, measuring human lives in productivity, obedience, and value. The horror lay not only in what had been done, but in the quiet efficiency with which it had been maintained for decades, hidden beneath polite smiles and civic ritual. In the end, the story of the Thornfield sisters is not only one of loss, but of the terrifying subtlety of human cruelty. Evil does not always scream. It can wait in letters, in contracts, in the polite indifference of a community eager to ignore inconvenient truths. It shapes itself around opportunity, disguises itself as benevolence, and ensures compliance without lifting a hand. And sometimes the most harrowing terror is the knowledge that the choices were never real, that the world turned a blind eye, that horror arrived in silence and left lives, dreams, and hearts forever rewritten. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we remember them not as vanished, but as transformed, and we understand that true evil does not always break locks or shout in the night. Often, it studies, it waits, it calculates, and when it is finished, it leaves a world that believes itself safe, calm, and just, while beneath the surface, the echoes of innocence stolen continue to whisper. The final chapter of the Thornfield story revealed horrors that even the most seasoned investigators could scarcely comprehend. Marcus Peyton, the architect of the trafficking network, had left behind a legacy of cruelty so systematic and deliberate that it exposed not just isolated acts of evil, but an entire machine designed to prey upon innocence. His personal records, letters, and ledgers painted a portrait of a man whose intellect and charm masked an almost sociopathic capacity for manipulation. He understood people as instruments, families, communities, even entire towns could be directed, corralled, and reshaped to serve his purpose. 17 of Peyton's associates were convicted alongside him, each charged with conspiracy, human trafficking, bribery, and corruption. Their trials peeled back layers of deception that had endured for decades, revealing a network of complicity that spanned law enforcement, political offices, and business institutions. But even with the spotlight of justice, the web was not fully dismantled. Many participants escaped the law, protected by destroyed records, silenced witnesses, and the untimely deaths of key figures who might have exposed them. Politicians, judges, and business leaders who had exploited the Thornfields' plight went unpunished, their public facades intact even as private reputation crumbled beneath the weight of scandal. For the surviving Thornfield sisters, the aftermath presented a choice more agonizing than any captivity could inflict: to testify, to expose the truth, or to preserve the fragile lives they had carved out for themselves after years of survival under coercion. Margaret, living as Mary Patterson, embraced courage at unimaginable cost. Her testimony chronicled 23 years of forced compliance, of stolen youth, and of the quiet, persistent suffering that had defined her existence. She spoke with clarity, with dignity, narrating the psychological violence of captivity with a precision that turned courtroom walls into witness to a horror few had imagined possible. In doing so, she became a voice for hundreds of women whose fates remained unspoken, setting legal precedents that would slowly begin to protect those vulnerable to exploitation. Catherine and Elizabeth, however, chose silence. Caroline Phillips, once Catherine, nurtured a life in Milwaukee with children who knew nothing of the darkness from which she had emerged. Revealing the truth would have shattered their security and on the fragile stability she had built, and exposed her to threats that lingered even decades after her initial capture. Elizabeth, living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, could not endure revisiting the trauma of her twins' separation and the relentless manipulation that had forced obedience. Their decisions were neither cowardice nor concession, they were survival, the ultimate act of quiet resistance in a world that had demanded compliance for decades. Investigators respected these choices, recognizing that justice, while necessary, could never fully repair the lives broken by systematic cruelty. Selkirk itself bore scars that would never fully fade. The town's residents, once intertwined in the prosperity of the Thornfield family and the investments of the Rocky Mountain Development Company, were forced to confront a foundation of greed and corruption. Many departed, unwilling to continue living atop a community built on exploitation and betrayal. The Thornfield mansion, standing empty since Gabriel's flight to Denver, was torn down, its absence a silent acknowledgement that some structures could not endure the weight of their histories. In the local cemetery, the 7 marble headstones were replaced with a single monument engraved with a truth long denied. To the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal, may truth finally set you free. Funded by contributions from across Montana, it ensured that even in absence, their memory endured, etched into stone as a warning and a remembrance. The consequences of the case radiated far beyond Selkirk. Federal law evolved, recognizing the dangers posed by unregulated agencies, unaccountable intermediaries, and the social vulnerabilities that had allowed the organization to thrive. Interstate cooperation improved, communication networks were formalized, and procedures for handling missing persons were standardized. Yet the deeper revelation remained not in bureaucracy or law, but in human nature. That desperation and isolation could render entire communities susceptible to manipulation, that the promise of opportunity could mask the machinery of bondage. The Thornfield sisters' ordeal illuminated the particular vulnerabilities of frontier life. Young women, confined by limited economic prospects and social expectation, had been presented with what appeared to be a path to advancement, only to be delivered into arrangements that stripped them of identity, autonomy, and future. The criminal organization had understood that the veneer of civility letters, invitations, credentials was enough to persuade parents and towns alike to consent to arrangements they would have otherwise rejected. This was horror cloaked in respectability, exploitation dressed as opportunity, obedience bought with the illusion of benefit. Even decades later, the lessons endured. Law enforcement agencies studied the organization's meticulous methods, incorporating strategies to prevent similar crimes, to safeguard the vulnerable, and to recognize the subtle forms of coercion that could bind families in silence. Social policy shifted incrementally, seeking to address the conditions that made exploitation possible: poverty, isolation, and the imbalance of opportunity. The legacy of Selkirk, of the Thornfield sisters, persisted as a warning that evil does not always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it turns promise into a cage and obedience into chains. In the Gospel of the Haunted, we remember them not as victims who vanished, but as witnesses to the depths of human cunning, as reminders that the truest terror is often quiet, methodical, and cloaked in civility. Evil does not always break locks or shout in the night. Often it studies, it waits, it calculates, and when it is finished, it leaves a world that believes itself safe, calm, and just, while beneath the surface, the echoes of stolen innocence continue to whisper, shaping memory, warning the living, and haunting every quiet street where opportunity once masked despair. The tragedy of the Thornfield sisters reminds us that desperation is a shadow that can blind even the most devoted, that the pursuit of prosperity can carry the quietest and deadliest cost. Gabriel Thornfield, a father who dreamed of providing better lives for his daughters, became ensnared by promises that promised hope but delivered horror. His desire to secure their futures made him vulnerable to forces that saw youth, innocence, and beauty not as treasures to protect, but as commodities to trade, to manipulate, to control. In seeking to secure a better life, he inadvertently became part of the machine that destroyed everything he loved. The 7 sisters of Selkirk vanished into a world hidden in plain sight, a system that treated them not as human beings but as assets. Their laughter, creativity, and vitality were erased, replaced by obedience to strangers and lives meticulously mapped by unseen hands. Each sister endured a captivity calculated to break not only their bodies but their bonds to one another, to erase memory, hope, and identity. Yet even within this darkness, the human spirit persisted. Margaret, who would later become Mary Patterson, chose courage over silence. She testified, revealing the horrors inflicted on herself and others, ensuring that some measure of justice would reach the lives still at risk. and that those who had built empires and human suffering would finally confront the consequences of their cruelty. The story of Selkirk is not merely about loss, but about the fragile cost of the American dream. Progress and opportunity, when unchecked, can become instruments of exploitation. The frontier, with its isolation and lack of oversight, created perfect conditions for predators who traded hope for power and control. The sisters' suffering exposes a society willing to look away when ambition and profit demanded it. A chilling reminder that material advancement is hollow if built on the destruction of innocence. And yet, questions linger. Were all the secrets of this century-old conspiracy ever uncovered? Did Selkirk represent the limits of this trafficking network, or was it merely one node in a vast, shadow enterprise that preyed on families throughout the West? Its victims erased from history and memory. The echoes of Selkirk whisper still, urging us to watch, to remember, to question. Evil does not always break doors. Sometimes it waits, calculating, invisible and patient. Sometimes it leaves nothing but empty streets and quiet towns, hiding the truth in plain sight while the world continues to rise and fall unaware.